Do you ever feel a shiver down your spine when you're alone in the dark? It's a primal instinct, a fear of the unknown. We tell ourselves it's just our imagination. But deep down, a part of us wonders, what if it's not? Horror stories tap into that primal fear. They make us confront the darkness within ourselves and the world around us. Tonight, I'm going to share one such story. It's a story that has haunted me for years. It's a story about isolation, paranoia, and the terrifying realization that we are not alone. This is the story of the cabin in the woods. The story centers around a young couple, Mark and Sarah. They had been together for several years, living in the bustling city, surrounded by the constant hum of urban life. Despite their love for each other, the stress of their daily routines was beginning to take a toll on their relationship. They were city dwellers, yearning for a break from the noise and chaos. The relentless pace of the city had left them feeling drained and disconnected from each other. They longed for a place where they could reconnect and find peace. They decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods. It was a place they had found online, promising tranquility and a chance to escape from their hectic lives. The picture showed a charming wooden cabin nestled deep within a dense forest. It seemed like the perfect getaway. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of nature. It was exactly what they needed to unwind and rediscover their bond. It was miles from the nearest town. The journey to the cabin took them down a long, winding forest road, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The further they drove, the more they felt the weight of their worries lifting. The silence was what drew them in. The peacefulness of the forest was a stark contrast to the constant noise they were used to. It was a silence that enveloped them, offering a sense of calm they hadn't felt in years. At first, it was peaceful. They spent their days exploring the forest, enjoying the serenity of their surroundings. The cabin became their sanctuary, a place where they could relax and forget about their troubles. But as the sun began to set, the silence became oppressive. The once comforting quiet now felt heavy and foreboding. The forest, which had seemed so inviting during the day, took on a more sinister tone as darkness fell. It was broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant howls of animals. The sounds of the forest at night were unsettling, a reminder that they were far from civilization. Whispers seemed to emerge from the shadows. The darkness played tricks on their minds, making them hear things that weren't there. The whispers grew louder, filling the cabin with an eerie presence. Strange noises echoed through the empty rooms. The creaking of the wooden floors and the howling wind outside added to the sense of unease. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. Mark dismissed them as their imaginations running wild. He tried to reassure Sarah, telling her that it was just the natural sounds of the forest, but even he couldn't completely shake the feeling that something was off. Sarah, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She felt a presence, something watching them from the shadows. The whispers in the night grew louder, and the sense of dread became overwhelming. The cabin itself was old. It creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets. Family portraits lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow Mark and Sarah's every move. One portrait in particular unsettled Sarah. It depicted a man with piercing blue eyes and a cold, unsettling smile. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching them. Mark laughed off her concerns. He told her she was letting her imagination get the best of her. But as the days turned into nights, he couldn't deny the growing sense of unease that had settled over them. They started to see things in the woods, strange, unexplainable things that made their skin crawl and their hearts race. It began with fleeting glimpses of movement in the corner of their eyes, shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the reach of their vision. Fleeting shadows that vanished when they turned their heads. These shadows seemed to have a life of their own, moving with an eerie grace that defied logic. They would catch a glimpse of a figure, only for it to disappear the moment they tried to focus on it. Footprints in the dirt that led to nowhere. These prints were unlike any animal tracks they had ever seen, and they appeared overnight, as if something had been watching them while they slept. The prints would start in the middle of the path and end abruptly, leaving no clue as to where the creature had gone. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if the very trees had eyes, and the forest itself was alive with a malevolent presence. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent shivers down their spines. They could feel the weight of unseen eyes following their every move. One evening as they sat by the fireplace, they heard a knock at the door. It was a sound that shattered the fragile peace they had tried to build. The knock was slow and deliberate, echoing through the cabin like a sinister heartbeat. Mark went to answer it, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the night was still. He stepped outside, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Only the sound of their own racing hearts filled the silence. They stood there, frozen, listening intently for any sign of movement. The fear was palpable, a living thing that wrapped around them like a cold, suffocating blanket. They tried to rationalize the strange occurrences. They told themselves it was just their imagination, that the isolation was playing tricks on their minds. They spoke in hushed tones, trying to convince each other that there was a logical explanation for everything. They told themselves it was just animals. Perhaps a deer or a raccoon had wandered close to the cabin, but deep down, they knew that the truth was far more sinister. The sounds they heard were not those of harmless creatures, but something far more menacing. But deep down, they knew something was amiss. The unease gnawed at them, a constant reminder that they were not alone. The forest, once a place of beauty and tranquility, had become a realm of fear and uncertainty. The isolation of the cabin had become a prison. What was once a sanctuary from the chaos of the world now felt like a trap, with the walls closing in around them. The vast expanse of the forest seemed to mock their helplessness. The darkness had become a breeding ground for their fears. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every creak of the floorboards a sign of impending doom. They were prisoners of their own minds, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Section 5. The Watcher in the Woods. One night, Sarah woke up to a strange noise outside their window. It was a soft, almost imperceptible rustling like the whisper of leaves in the wind, but it was enough to jolt her from her sleep. She lay still for a moment, listening intently, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise came again, a little louder this time, and she knew she had to see what it was. She looked out into the darkness, her eyes straining to see through the thick veil of night. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the landscape, making the trees look like twisted, ghostly figures. She felt a chill run down her spine as she scanned the edge of the woods, searching for the source of the noise. She could have sworn she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was just a shadow at first, barely distinguishable from the trees around it, but as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, the figure became clearer. It was tall and slender, almost unnaturally so, and it seemed to be watching her. It was tall and slender, with eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Terrified, she woke Mark. She shook him gently at first, then more urgently as the fear took hold. "Mark, wake up," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something outside." At first he was skeptical. He rubbed his eyes and looked at her with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "It's probably just an animal," he said, trying to reassure her. But the look in her eyes told him that this was something different, something more sinister. But when he looked out the window and saw the figure too, a chill ran down his spine. He stared at it for a moment, unable to believe what he was seeing. The figure was still there, standing motionless at the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes fixed on their window. They watched in horror as it slowly turned its head and stared directly at them. The movement was slow and deliberate, almost as if it knew they were watching. Its eyes seemed to bore into their souls, filling them with a sense of dread they had never felt before. They knew then that they were not alone. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut, leaving them breathless and terrified. They clung to each other, their minds racing with questions. Who or what was this figure, and what did it want with them? Something was out there, watching them. It felt like a nightmare come to life, a scene from a horror movie playing out right before their eyes. They could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, as if it was studying them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And it was getting closer. With each passing second, the figure seemed to inch closer to the house, its movement slow but purposeful. They could see it more clearly now, its features becoming more defined in the moonlight. The terror they felt was overwhelming, and they knew they had to do something before it was too late. Panic set in. They tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. The phone lines were dead. They were trapped. They barricaded themselves inside the cabin, the sound of their own fear echoing in their ears. The figure outside began to circle the cabin. They could hear its heavy breathing, its low growl. It was toying with them, savoring their fear. They knew they had to do something. They had to find a way to escape. But where could they go? They were surrounded by darkness, hunted by something they didn't understand. Mark, desperate to protect Sarah, decided to confront whatever was outside. He grabbed a heavy fireplace poker and slowly opened the cabin door. The night air was thick with dread. The figure was gone. He stepped outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the woods, but he couldn't see anything. Just when he thought it was gone, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around to face his attacker, but there was no one there. He was alone. Or so he thought. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, Mark and Sarah stumbled out of the cabin. They were exhausted, terrified, and forever changed by the horrors they had experienced. They never went back to the cabin. The police never found any evidence of an intruder. Some say it was all in their heads. Others believe they were victims of something sinister, but one thing is for sure. They will never forget the fear that gripped them that night. The fear of isolation, the fear of being watched, the fear of the unknown. The story of the cabin in the woods is a chilling reminder that some fears are universal. It's a story about the darkness that lurks within us all and the horrors that can unfold when we are confronted with the unknown. What do you think really happened that night? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you dare, check out my other expeditions into the unknown on my YouTube channel. Sweet dreams.